All right, so thank you for having me. There's nothing harder than talking after lunch, but I guess if there weren't turkey sandwiches, maybe I'll do better than usual. Also, speaking about innovation to a bunch of innovators is also difficult. I'm an economist. I teach economics and business at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke, and I'm going to talk about some of the work that I'm doing on innovation, but more importantly, some of the work that we're going to do with the American Heart Association. So to start, let me just talk to you a little bit about my perspective. I know you guys had this great discussion yesterday with Vinod Khosla, and there was lots of discussion about what is innovation, what's going on out there. As an economist, I do have a perspective. I think if you look at these two pictures, I'm a big car guy, so I think a lot about cars. And if you look at the left, the way cars used to be made, versus on the right, which is the way cars are made now, just another way to think about this is in 1950, it took probably 25,000 workers to do what 5,000 workers can do in Michigan today. And that's why GM has, far fewer workers than they did making cars. A lot of people think that this is driving everything you're seeing in the 2016 election, right? Automation, as opposed to trade from China, has changed sort of the landscape of jobs. And a lot of people think that this is what's going to happen to healthcare. And when people talk about innovation, I think people have something in mind where all of a sudden healthcare is going to be transformed by technology the way that all these other sectors of the economy have been. And there's a lot of loose talk about this, frankly. And as an economist, when I look about this, I think a lot about what the production function in healthcare is. Simply put, I think a lot of people think that they're going to replace labor with technology, the way we did in manufacturing. And I think in healthcare, there's a lot of assumptions that are not true in terms of how we're going to make that happen. So let me tell you what I think. One is, I think that disruption, and I hate to say this in San Francisco, but in general, it's actually pretty hard. If you don't just cherry pick studies and you look at disruption across many different industries and you think about when do new startups win versus incumbents, it turns out, right, a lot of Clay Christensen's original work has sort of been modified, and it's one of these things that's seldom, it's always cited but very seldom read, and people think they know what disruption is. The startups don't always win. The innovators don't always win. The industry doesn't always get disrupted. Everybody wants to disrupt everything they don't like. They want to disrupt government. They want to disrupt healthcare. They want to disrupt education. But in a lot of ways, I think disruption has been proven to be actually really difficult. And if you're going to bet on something, I don't think betting on total disruption is usually a bet that pays off. Second, healthcare is pretty unique. A lot of people want to do like lean startup, MVP style testing. When I show this picture to my undergrads, they have no idea what that picture is. I say, wait 10 years and you'll know what we were testing here with the baby Bjorn. Their ignorance is blissful, really it is. So if you think about healthcare, okay, a lot of people want to run experiments. They want to do lean startup style testing. And look, I read this stuff, I teach this stuff. It's really important, and it's having a huge impact in lots of sectors of entrepreneurship and innovation. But everyone in this room knows that in healthcare it's very different. And it also depends, what side healthcare you're thinking about. Medical devices, pharmaceuticals, mobile healthcare apps. You're also in a B2B context rather than a B2C, so business to business instead of business to consumer in many cases. And lean startup style testing in a B2B setting, like in a hospital, very, very different. And that's kind of what I think about when I talk about healthcare being unique. And finally, I do think, ecosystem, I shouldn't pick on the word disruption and then use like the second most overused word in the history of the world, which is ecosystem. But there is actually a real ecosystem in healthcare, and what I mean is a bunch of different players have an impact on the outcome. So even if there's a change in one part of the value chain, where let's say consumers are adopting a new technology, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to raise outcomes and lower costs, because there's lots of other players. And so getting all these elephants to dance at the same time is actually really difficult because all these gears are related. Now, it's very different if you're thinking about a lot of our consumer internet products that have like revolutionized different spaces like social networking, for example, or hailing a taxi. I think the ecosystem of healthcare is probably one of the biggest barriers, I think, to doing true innovation, because you have to get coordination at a much, much higher level. And when you think about coordination, you also have to talk about the role of government. I spent 2 years working for President Obama in the Council of Economic Advisors. Government matters in this space a lot more than some of the other spaces that have been disrupted. It's actually the same thing in education, which is another area I do a lot of work in. And I think that if government's going to be a part of this, the whole disruptive innovation meme is going to have to be sort of modified, because government moves a little more slowly, even at its best. So what are we going to do about it at AHA? Sort of what can we do about it here? So what we're going to try and do is study this a little bit and understand how the ecosystem is evolving. So I'm proud to say that I'm working on this study with a few people in the room and hopefully more. And what this ecosystem innovation study is going to do is first start with the history. And we're going to focus on sort of cardiovascular disease, I guess is our narrow focus to get started. And we're going to look at historical data on innovation in this space. We're going to start with patents, product approvals from the FDA, financings from venture capital firms, IPOs, and exits. And we're going to also include some case studies on successful and failed innovations. Obviously, when you do case studies, you want to make sure you don't just pick winners. You get a very distorted view of how innovation works. And then through researching evidence on these past innovations, we want to develop a forward-thinking strategy. So the thesis we have is if we can understand how innovations have been created in this space in the past, we're going to understand a little bit more what we can do going forward. Now, there are some reasons you might think that that is a faulty assumption. Now, perhaps the past will not predict the future. So we're going to have to do a lot of prognostication, too, and think about what's changed. And that'll also be part of this study. This is really aligning directly with what the AHA's 2020 impact goal is. And we hope that we can be a huge part of the center that was announced earlier today in terms of informing and building the intellectual capital behind the health innovation practice at the AHA. So I'm going to lead the study. Eric Peterson, who is here, and Robert Harrington, who is here, will be guiding it. And I think sort of the worker bees, the people who are going to be doing a lot of the work, are going to be our cardiology fellows at both these great institutions. So our hope is that the cardiology fellows are going to be doing some of these case studies, getting exposure to some of these new technologies and innovations, learning the history of what's happened in cardiovascular care, and informing this study that we're going to do on behalf of the American Heart Association. So here's the proposed study design. The introduction will introduce some of those case studies I've talked about. You know, we've had a lot of back and forth about quantitative versus qualitative evidence. Almost all my research at Duke is quantitative. I collect big data sets and run regressions. And there's a lot of advantages to that, but sometimes that's not the whole story. So I hope that we'll do both here. Qualitative work, obviously, is very sort of engaging. People can relate to the case studies, but sometimes it can be misleading because we think that we're essentially going to learn from outliers rather than learning from the average. We're going to try to have a mix of both qualitative and quantitative data in our introductions and our case studies. We're thinking around 10 to 20 of these case studies, 5 to 10 pages each. Innovations don't necessarily need to be successful. They need to be representative. They need to tell us something about the ecosystem so we can figure it out. Our hope is to have a relatively broad scope so we can speak to the variety and diversity that's in cardiovascular health, from pharma, biotech, medtech, digital health. Of course, some of this is newer than others. The fellows would probably take ownership of 1 to 3 cases, and it would be our job as the PIs to sort of integrate them. And then the summary and the path forward is to figure out what this all means. And that's the part I think Eric, myself, and Bob will be working on quite closely. So the introduction will talk about the motivation, why we're doing this. You know, we've heard from a lot of stakeholders in industry, in government, in academia, that somehow innovation is slowing down, or somehow there's obstacles to innovation that weren't there before. Sometimes they'll cite venture capital statistics. Sometimes they'll cite product approval statistics. Sometimes they'll just cite statistics about outcomes, and then they're not moving in the right direction fast enough in particular areas. So we're going to talk about that and the motivation. And then we're going to look back and see the impact of some of the really successful innovations, how they came to pass, and also chart some of the historical trends about how these things were sort of invented and commercialized. As you know, the idea is just the idea. And so the ecosystem that commercializes these ideas is going to be equally important and be sort of in the forefront of this study. The case studies are going to be based on interviews with business leaders, investors, entrepreneurs, inventors, physicians, hopefully a cross-section of people in this room and other rooms, also policymakers and patients. So we hope to get sort of a wide spectrum of ideas here. Some of the questions we'll probably ask in the interviews: where did the idea originate? You know, there's a geographic component here. A lot of people are interested if the great ideas are only occurring in these clusters, places like San Francisco, Boston, New York, Raleigh-Durham, Austin, or are they coming from all over the country? How are these ideas tested, refined, and scaled? Was it the same person who invented the idea who was actually the one sort of doing the testing? What was the role of government through funding mechanisms like the NIH, venture capital firms like the ones represented in this room, and of course leading universities like the ones that are staffing this project? What's the sort of importance of the regulatory regime and also reimbursement? Obviously, the R&R is sort of 2 key components that we need to understand if we're going to do this. And finally, and most importantly, the reason that we are all in the room today: what's the impact on patients? So at the end, we'll draw up some of the implications. I think there's sort of 3 things we'll probably highlight here based on our initial work. The role of financial capital, which is going to be central here. Is capital being funded to the greatest innovations that we have today, or is there some sort of gap? And I think people make claims about that. We'd like to be a little bit more definitive. intellectual capital, right? Where are these new ideas going to come from to create the next great innovations? And what's the role of what you might call enabling institutions, universities that do translational research, government entities that fund commercialization? And are there any potential lessons, right? These will be sort of lessons, not recommendations, and consistent with the mission of the AHA, for decision makers who want to encourage innovation and pursue a path forward. So that's the goal and what we're trying to do here from the AHA perspective. So timeline, it's always good to chart out a timeline so you can hopefully keep on schedule. We're going to commence in October next month, collect a lot of the data and try to do some of the interviews in the beginning of 2017, and complete the first draft in April 2017. If we do that, we think we'll be well positioned to have a symposium in June of 2017 and hopefully have some press and a bunch of discussions with key decision makers around that. The idea is not that the event would just start and end and that would be the conversation. The idea is it would sort of be a rolling introduction of lots of different ideas, and maybe we revisit some of those themes in smaller sessions afterwards. So the symposium, right, the goals might be to present the study's key findings to a broad group. And it's important to get a lot of different kinds of people in the room, from technology, from healthcare, from health tech, and from finance and government. We'd hopefully gather some feedback, we'd assess interest, and we'd hopefully highlight some future areas. This would be the beginning of the generation of a lot of intellectual capital products from the AHA and this center. So the participants in terms of the symposium, we would have the people who participated in the study, the interviewees, but hopefully also some innovators who weren't in this study, okay, in particular therapeutic areas. Also funders who might be interested in looking at this research in the future to inform their work, and all the study supporters who are members of the AHA Health Tech Collaborative, many of whom are here today. So what I want to leave you with is I think there's a lot of promise in innovation in this space, but I think there's a lot we need to know. The AHA has, I think, an important role in trying to generate the intellectual capital. I hope that many of you in the room will be part of this effort. I think I'd rather than take a lot of time with questions now, I'll be here for the rest of the conference. If people want to talk to me offline about how they can help or answer some questions, if I can answer some questions about the project, I'd love to do so. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.